At 4:26 a.m. local time, the Pacific Ocean was nearly pitch black. Only the faint reflection of a thin, ghost-like moon shimmered across the water as a small, low-profile vessel moved silently through the waves. Two men sat at the helm, their faces hidden beneath balaclavas, their eyes fixed on the horizon. They were moving through the Eastern Corridor, one of the most dangerous and profitable trafficking routes in the hemisphere. Their fiberglass boat carried more than fuel and adrenaline. It carried tightly wrapped bundles of narcotics sealed under waterproof tarps, money for a regime, and danger for anyone who crossed their path. What they did not know was that, more than 600 miles overhead, an American satellite had already spotted them. Every infrared flicker from their engines, every encrypted radio signal, every transmission bouncing toward Venezuela's coast had been marked and tracked. The order to engage would not come from a local commander. It would come from the President of the United States himself. In Washington, the chain of command was brief and precise. Intelligence confirmed the target. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was briefed on the vessel's location, movement, and payload. Then came the words that sealed the fate of everyone on board: execute. By dawn, the world would see the explosion in a clip just 6 seconds long, later posted by Hegseth on social media. But what that short video did not show was the vast system that made the strike possible. The U.S. Navy's newest strike network had already triangulated the boat's position through a layered web of surveillance stretching from a KH-11 reconnaissance satellite to a Reaper drone orbiting 22,000 feet above the Pacific. The Reaper's AN/DAS-1 MTS-B sensor was locked in on infrared. Every burst of heat from the twin 250 horsepower engines appeared as a bright signal on the screen. At 4:59 a.m., the drone recorded a small V-shaped wake cutting across a mild sea state. Inside the control center at Joint Interagency Task Force South in Key West, analysts matched the pattern to a known smuggling vessel linked to the Venezuelan cartel Tren de Aragua. Cross-checking intelligence from the DEA, NSA, and Coast Guard confirmed what the Pentagon had already begun to suspect. This was not a fishing boat. This was a moving artery in a billion-dollar trafficking network, shielded by the Venezuelan state. For months, these go-fast boats had raced from Venezuela's coastline toward the Galapagos Gap, transporting tons of narcotics towards Central America. They were fast, cheap, and extremely difficult to detect on radar. Small enough to evade attention, yet large enough to carry thousands of pounds of illegal cargo, they operated at the very edge of what was possible. But speed and stealth mean little against an eye that never blinks. Since early September, the United States had shifted its naval posture across Latin American waters. Under what officials called Operation Sentinel South, 8 major U.S. Navy vessels were now patrolling the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. The USS Bainbridge, USS Gravely, and USS Kidd were assigned to monitor trafficking corridors, supported by Coast Guard cutters and maritime patrol aircraft. At the same time, the USS Gerald R. Ford, America's newest supercarrier, had quietly passed through the Strait of Gibraltar, with its escort group spreading out across the hemisphere. For Washington, this was deterrence through presence. For the cartels, it signaled something very different: the beginning of the end. The morning of the strike began like many others before it. The Reaper drone, operated remotely from Creech Air Force Base in Nevada, maintained a holding pattern over the Eastern Pacific. Its sensor operator watched the suspected vessel for nearly 2 hours, documenting erratic course changes, mid-ocean rendezvous maneuvers, and the complete absence of navigation lights. Intelligence officers relayed updates through encrypted satellite links to the Pentagon, where Hegseth and his advisors assembled the case for lethal authorization. At 9:12 a.m. Washington time, the president received the briefing. His directive was blunt: take them out. At sea level, the target remained unaware. The two men adjusted their outboard motors, burning fuel to maintain speed. They had no idea that in the infrared spectrum, their exhaust shone like a flare in a tunnel. The Reaper's Hellfire missile locked onto the heat signature automatically. One tone, then another. Locked. The strike came without a sound. There was no warning shot, no radio call, no attempted interception. Only a sudden white flash in the darkness, captured by the drone's sensor. A single point of light expanded into a fireball as fuel and fiberglass were instantly consumed. In less than a heartbeat, the vessel was gone. Debris scattered across the sea. A rolling shockwave dissolved into the night. 2 men, 2 engines, and several hundred kilos of narcotics disappeared in an instant. In Washington, Defense Secretary Hegseth posted the short, unclassified clip with a statement. Intelligence confirmed that the vessel was involved in illicit narcotics smuggling. 2 male narco-terrorists aboard were killed. No U.S. personnel were harmed. He added a phrase that would echo throughout the intelligence community. "We're not fighting fishermen, we're fighting terrorists on the water." Behind that statement, the numbers revealed a broader escalation. Since early September, more than a dozen similar strikes had already been carried out across the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. The toll had risen to more than 50 dead, dozens of vessels destroyed, and an unknown quantity of narcotics lost. Each operation followed the same sequence: detection by satellite, confirmation by drone, authorization from Washington, strike within minutes. For military analysts, it was a textbook example of the American kill chain, a process built to eliminate threats faster than they could adapt. But not everyone was convinced. On Capitol Hill, several lawmakers criticized the campaign, questioning whether the administration had the constitutional authority to launch lethal operations without congressional approval. They demanded proof that the boats targeted were truly involved in narcotics trafficking and not misidentified civilian vessels. Some described it as an undeclared conflict. Others saw it as executive overreach. But for supporters, it marked a new phase in maritime security, the point where counterterrorism strategy and counter-narcotics operations merged into a single doctrine of interdiction at sea. President Trump brushed aside the criticism. During an impromptu exchange with reporters outside the White House on October 23rd, he made it clear that his administration had no intention of seeking a formal declaration of war. His language stunned Washington, but it also captured the new strategic mindset in the bluntest possible terms. The United States, in this doctrine, was no longer content to pursue traffickers through slow legal processes and narrow technicalities. It intended to stop them wherever they operated. The location of these operations was no accident. Many of the strikes had taken place off the coast of Venezuela, a region increasingly associated with narcotics networks, corruption, and political protection. Under Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela's ports and naval infrastructure had, according to intelligence assessments, become reliable safe zones for cartel logistics. Analysts described the relationship between the regime and trafficking groups as mutually beneficial. The state offered cover, and the cartels generated revenue. From Washington's perspective, that made the distinction almost meaningless. Earlier that year, the administration had formally designated several Latin American cartels as terrorist organizations, including the notorious Tren de Aragua. That designation was far more than symbolic. It opened the door for the Pentagon to apply the laws of armed conflict to cartel-linked assets. Ships, warehouses, and even aircraft connected to those organizations could now be treated as legitimate operational targets. With that legal framework in place, the Navy and Air Force began operating in a zone that was neither conventional war nor peacetime policing, but something in between: active enforcement through precision action. As the campaign expanded, so did the military presence supporting it. The Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, led by one of the most advanced carriers ever built, was redirected toward the Caribbean in support of what Pentagon officials described as persistent maritime dominance. The Ford's AN/S, PY-6 radar, and F-35C squadrons extended surveillance across a vast area stretching thousands of miles. The USS Bainbridge and USS Gravely served as rapid response platforms, prepared to assist with recovery, surveillance, or follow-up interdictions after each operation. For the sailors on those ships, the mission blurred the line between law enforcement and combat operations. They were not trading fire with enemy fleets. They were carrying out high-tech, highly coordinated actions against elusive targets that often appeared only as tiny, fast-moving marks on a radar screen. Most were harmless. A few were not. And that uncertainty defined every hour at sea. One sonar technician aboard the Bainbridge later described the atmosphere in simple terms. It was like hunting in fog. You rarely saw the danger clearly until the moment had already passed. By the night after the strike, the Pacific was calm again. Only scattered debris marked the place where the vessel had once been. A Coast Guard aircraft operating from Panama City arrived to photograph the site and confirm total destruction. The Reaper drone returned to base after a 6-hour mission. From takeoff to impact, the total operational distance had stretched roughly 1,400 miles. Reported collateral damage: 0. Inside the Pentagon Situation Room, analysts replayed the footage frame by frame at quarter speed. Every second reflected a sequence of extraordinary coordination, from satellite cueing to final impact. The data showed a near-perfect chain of efficiency: detection to authorization in under 10 minutes, engagement in less than 1. It was modern warfare reduced to timing, signals, and mathematics. But key questions remained. Who exactly were the men on board? And what was their connection to Tren de Aragua? Investigators began tracing satellite phone numbers collected during earlier raids. One number linked back to a communication network used by a cartel financier reportedly operating under the protection of Venezuelan intelligence. Another signal was traced near La Guaira, the major naval port east of Caracas. To analysts, those details reinforced what they had already begun to conclude. These were not random smugglers operating on their own. These were protected assets moving narcotics in service of a larger criminal structure. As dawn broke over Washington, Hegseth addressed the press once again. His delivery was calm but unambiguous. "This operation demonstrates the reach, precision, and resolve of U.S. forces," he said. "Our objective is simple: deny the cartel's freedom of movement. No safe harbors, no untouchables." Behind him, a still image from the strike appeared on a monitor, a single burst of flame against an endless black sea. Hours later in Caracas, President Maduro appeared on state television visibly furious. He condemned the strike as an assault on Venezuelan sovereignty and promised to defend the country's maritime interests. In practice, however, there was little his navy could do. Hampered by fuel shortages, aging ships, and limited operational readiness, the Venezuelan fleet was struggling even to patrol its own coastline. American drones, by contrast, could remain overhead for hours without serious challenge. Among ordinary Venezuelans, reactions were divided. Some saw the operation as foreign interference. Others quietly suggested that the Americans were doing what their own government had long failed to do: break apart the trafficking networks that had transformed once peaceful coastal communities into smuggling corridors. In barrios across Maracaibo and Cumaná, symbols linked to Tren de Aragua were reportedly defaced overnight. Fear had started turning into calculation. Association now carried a visible cost. Within U.S. military circles, the debate shifted quickly to strategy. Was this sustainable deterrence, or was it the opening step in a wider escalation? The Navy's own after-action review concluded that precision drone strikes were both cheaper and safer than traditional interdiction missions. A single Hellfire missile, costing roughly $115,000, could destroy millions of dollars worth of narcotics and wipe out months of cartel logistics. By contrast, operating a destroyer for a single intercept could cost close to $500,000 per day. From a purely economic standpoint, the advantage was obvious, but the psychological effect may have mattered even more. Every strike sent shockwaves through trafficking networks. Boat captains began refusing new runs. Financiers redirected shipments inland, where they became more vulnerable to Colombian and Panamanian forces. For the cartels, the sea, once a shield, was starting to look like a trap. Inside the Situation Room, officials discussed what came next. Intelligence suggested that multiple cartel-linked vessels were preparing to depart from Venezuelan and Ecuadorian ports within days. Surveillance platforms were repositioned. Drones were refueled, satellites were retasked. The system was already moving again. By evening, the president summarized the campaign in a single line during a phone interview. "We're not at war with Venezuela. We're at war with the poison they export." The simplicity of that statement hid the complexity beneath it. A campaign built from covert coordination, real-time surveillance, and rapid precision action, all fused into one seamless model of deterrence. The next day, another unclassified clip surfaced. Another strike, another flash in the dark. The same pattern, the same speed. The message was impossible to miss. The ocean was no longer a guaranteed corridor for narcotics trafficking. For the sailors of the Ford Strike Group, it felt like a quiet success. Somewhere beyond the horizon, they knew their presence had changed the balance. They did not dwell on the politics. Their focus was the mission. To them, each operation was a puzzle solved, a threat removed, a life perhaps protected back home. As the sun dropped behind the carrier's island tower, one petty officer stood on deck and watched the sky shift from orange to deep blue. The smell of jet fuel and salt hung in the air. He thought about the 6-second clip that had spread everywhere, that brief burst of light in the darkness. He thought about the 2 men on the boat, and about the countless families devastated by the narcotics trade. Then he turned back toward the flight deck, where the engine of an FA-18 roared to life. The machine never stopped. Hours later, far below the Pacific surface, the remains of the cartel vessels settled into silence. Fish circled the twisted wreckage. Within days, the sea would erase nearly every visible trace. But in databases across Washington, the event would remain preserved in exact detail. Timestamp, coordinates, target confirmed. The message sent by the United States was written in precision and force. The ocean belongs to law, not lawlessness. And as long as those waters remained under the watch of the American fleet, there would be no true sanctuary for those moving poison across the sea. The impact reached far beyond the Pacific. European intelligence services began sharing maritime tracking data with Southcom. The Colombian Navy launched new interdiction efforts in coordination with regional partners. Even allies in Africa began adjusting routes and risk calculations, anticipating a world in which maritime trafficking lanes were no longer invisible. For the cartels, the era of impunity was beginning to close. For the U.S. Navy, it was proof that 21st century conflict was no longer defined by fleets colliding on the horizon, but by networks outmaneuvering other networks. In the end, the strike on that cartel vessel off Venezuela was more than a single explosion. It marked the moment an entire doctrine came into focus. Intelligence, technology, and political will fused into one decisive instrument. It showed that a superpower does not always announce itself with spectacle. Sometimes it simply watches, calculates, and acts. And somewhere out on the water, as another smuggler pushed his engines into the night, he may have glanced upward at a faint silent glimmer in the sky, wondering whether it was just another star, or something far more dangerous. Because in the waters off Venezuela, the U.S. Navy was no longer relying on warnings, it was relying on reach.